Vishnu Vishnu Parashitara Shitashmat Shila Bhakti Vedanta Narayana Goswami Maharaj Shila Gurudev Ki Jai Nitil Vishnu Vishnu Parashitara Shitashmat Shila Bhakti Vedanta Vaman Goswami Maharaj Ki Jai Nitil Vishnu Vishnu Parashitara Shitashmat Shila Bhakti Vedanta Swami Maharaj Shila Prabhupada Ki Jai Nitil Vishnu Vishnu Par Ashitara Shitashmat Shila Bhakti Vigyan Keshav Goswami Maharaj Ki Jai Nitil Vishnu Vishnu Parashitara Shitashmat Shila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Goswami Prabhupada Ki Jai Nitil Vishnu Mahabhagavat Shila Gokisharas Babaji Maharaj Ki Jai Nitil Vishnu Shila Satchidananda Bhakti Vinod Thakur Ki Jai Nitil Vishnu Vaishnav Sarvabhauma Shila Jagannatha Shri Rupano Gauriya Guru Varga Ki Jai Shri Rup Sanatan Bhatta Raghunath Shri Jeev Gopal Patadash Raghunath Shar Goswami Prabhu Ki Jai Shri Sarup Damodar Rai Ramanandari Shri Gaur Parshad Vrinda Ki Jai Namacharya Lahairas Thakur Ki Jai Prem Se Kaho Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasari Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Ki Jai Shri Kshetra Mandal Gaura Mandal Vaja Mandal Mathura Vrindavan Dham Ki Jai Sarva Abhishta Bharata Giriraj Maharaj Ki Jai Shri Radha Kunda Shama Kund Ki Jai Shri Muna Devi Ganga Devi Ki Jai Shri Tulsi Maharani Vrinda Devi Ki Jai Shri Bhakti Devi Ki Jai Shri Purnamasi Yoga Maya Ki Jai Shri Gopeshwar Mahadev Ki Jai Shri Harinam Sankirtan Ki Jai Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda Ki Jai Samagata Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Ki Jai Shri Nitai Gaur Premanande Hari Hari Bo Om Jnanatimirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam yena tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha Namo Vishnu Padaya Radhikaya Priyatmane Shri Śrīmad Bhakti Vedanta Narayana Namine Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prashtaya Bhutale Śrīmate Bhakti Vedanta Swaminiti Namine Vanchakalpatarubhyascha kripa sindhubhya eva cha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha Namo Mahavadanyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gauratishe Namaha Guruve Gaurachandraya Radhikaya Tadalaye Krishnaya Krishna Bhaktaya Tarbhaktaya Namo Namaha Yam Pravrajantam Anupetam Apetakritam Dvaipayano Virahaka Tara Arjuhava Putreti Tanmayataya Taravo Bhinedus Tang Sarvabhuta Hridayam Munimanatosmi Narayanam Namaskritya Narang Chaiva Narottamam Devim Sarasatim Vyasam Tato Jayam Udirayet Shinvatang Swakata Krishna Punya Shavana Kirtana Hridantasto Yabhadrani Vidhunoti Suritsatam Nashta Prayeshvabhadreshu Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya Bhagavatuttama Shloke Bhaktir Bhavati Naishtaki Tavaivasmi Najivami Tvaya Vina Iti Vigyaya Radhe Tvam Nayamam Charanantikam Bhaktya Vihina Aparada Lakshay Kshiptashtakamaditarangamadhe Madhe Kripa Maitvam Sharanam Prapanna Vrinde Namaste Charanaravindam Bhaja Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasari Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Okay. Oh God, my internet's going really slow, huh? Doesn't seem to be loading. Anyways, Puranjan becomes a woman in the next life. So we read about Puranjan's death. Prajvara, Kalakanya, and the soldiers of Bhaya attack Puranjan's city. Puranjan becomes miserable. The city's superintendent, the five-hooded serpent, who is vital life air, couldn't defend the city and wished to leave it. Then Puranjan, he lamented about his wife and children. Attacked by bhai, by fear, Puranjan dies, and after death, the animals attack him, all the animals that he sacrificed. Then, in his next life, Puranjan becomes Vaidarbhī, and the description of Vaidarbhī marries Māyā, and then there's what did we read from this point yesterday? Okay, so let's just read from 32. Okay, so Puranjan died while remembering his wife, and consequently, in the next life, he was born as the beautiful daughter of the king of Vaidarbhā. Māyā, the best of the learned, and a conqueror of enemy cities, after defeating other kings in battle, married the daughter of King Vaidarbhā as a prize for his chivalry. Note, bhakti arises from the association of devotees by their spontaneous mercy. That is shown in Puranjan's next life as Vaidarbhī, where he attained the association of a devotee through marriage. The following are the real meanings of the terms. Okay, anyways, we read that yesterday. Māyā begot in Vaidarbhī a daughter who had very black eyes, and 7 younger sons who became kings of the 7 southern provinces. Note, the daughter Asitekshana means who received the glance of Krishna, or one who has a taste for serving Krishna, which is developed by the mercy of a guru. The 7 sons are Shravanam, Kirtanam, all the way up to Dasyam. Because Sakyam and Atmanivedanam are difficult in the beginning and will appear spontaneously later, they are not mentioned. One second. Further descendants. These 7 sons gave birth to thousands of sons whose descendants protected the entire world for the rest of Manu's life and after. 1 second, I need to... Note, many sons indicates that the processes like Shravanam be subdivided into innumerable categories in different ways, like hearing the name, the pastimes, or the qualities of the Lord, according to the worship of different avatars, according to different races. Their descendants are the 4 different sampradayas. They ruled the whole world. This means that the earth was protected from ignorance and materialistic karma yoga. Okay, Dandavat pranams, everybody. And Prajumna Prabhu, no, we shouldn't kill rodents if we can avoid it. Okay, daughter's descendants. Sage Agastya, the mind, married Asitekshana, taste for Krishna. From her, Dhritarchuta, so these are the daughter's descendants. From her, Dhritarchuta, devoid of attachment, was born. From Dhritarchuta, Idmavaha, one who carries firewood for sacrifice, or in other words, one who is surrendered to Guru, was born. Māyā and Vaidarbhī retired to the forest. Māyā retired and went to Kulachal, a place for bhakti, to worship Lord Krishna with full attention after dividing his kingdom among his sons. Note, when his disciples are grown up and able to preach, the spiritual master should retire and sit down in a solitary place to write and execute Nirjan Bhajan. Vaidarbhī followed him like the moonshine follows the moon at night. Being a devoted wife, She gave up the house, children, and enjoyments. Note, when the spiritual master retires for Nirjan Bhajan, some of his advanced devotees may follow him and engage in his personal service. Note B. Here, Vaidarbhī is called Madirekshana. Madirekshana refers to one whose eyes are intoxicated upon seeing the deity. Malaya Dwaja's austerities. At Kulachal, the king purified himself by bathing daily in the rivers Chandravasa, Tamraparni, and Vatodaka. Subsisting on roots, seeds, fruits, flowers, leaves, grass, and water, his body gradually became emaciated. Through austerity, he gradually conquered the dualities of cold and heat, wind and rain, hunger and thirst, pleasant and unpleasant conditions, happiness and distress. By austerity, knowledge, niyam, and yam, he conquered his senses, the life airs, and consciousness, and fixed his mind on Brahman, Vasudeva. For 100 celestial years, he remained fixed in one place. Then he developed rati for Vasudeva, and was not aware of anything else. He attained perfect knowledge by being able to distinguish the all-pervasive supersoul from the localized individual soul. He understood that the soul is the witness of the material body and different from it. Being directly instructed by the Lord, as Chaitaguru, he developed transcendental knowledge by which he could understand everything from all angles of vision, observe the supersoul and the soul, sitting side by side together without separate interests, and abstain from all material activities. Note, when a devotee is serious and sincere, the Lord gives directions from within. Instructions for a disciple from Vaidarbhī's example. Vaidarbhī, accepting her husband as the supreme, served her husband with devotion, giving up all enjoyment. Note, figuratively, Malaya Dwaja is the spiritual master, and his wife, Vaidarbhī, is the disciple. The disciple accepts the spiritual master as the supreme lord. In old garments, she was lean due to austerity, and her hair was matted. Though always near her husband, she was silent like the flame of an undisturbed fire. Note, if a disciple remains steady in serving his spiritual master, he need no longer fear falling down into the clutches of māyā. Service. She continued to serve her husband, unaware of his passing away. Not feeling the warmth of his feet, she understood that he had passed away. Thus, she felt exactly like a deer separated from its mate. Being now alone and a widow in the forest, she lamented, incessantly shedding tears and crying very loudly. Note, when the mortal body of the spiritual master expires, his disciple should cry exactly like this. However, a disciple is never separated from the spiritual master in spite of his physical, his vapu, absence, as long as he follows his instructions. Then he's not separated. She said, "O best of kings, please get up. You must protect this frightened world surrounded by the seas from thieves and false kings." Note, "O Guru, protect this earth in which you established bhakti, which is now frightened by those opposing bhakti." Lamenting in the forest, she fell down at the feet of her dead husband and began to cry pitifully and shed tears. She placed the dead body upon the funeral pyre. Lamenting severely, she prepared herself to enter the fire with her husband. Note, a devoted disciple would rather die with the spiritual master than fail to execute his mission. Or, to execute the will of the spiritual master, the disciple should be prepared to lay down his life and abandon all personal considerations. Now, Avijñāta, the Lord instructs Vaidarbhī. That's what we're reading today. Hari Bol. Just checking the sounds. Okay, looks good. Chapter 28, verse 51, right? I don't think we're going to be able to finish our reading quota today, because we'll just see where we get to at 8 o'clock, because I have scheduled today to read 6,200 words. Yesterday we read 5,700 words. So we'll just see how far we get. Tatra purvatara kaschit saka brahmana atmavan santvayan valguna samna tamaha rudatim prabhu. My dear king, one Brahman who was an old friend of King Puranjan came to that place and began to pacify the queen with sweet words. Purport by Srila Prabhupada. The appearance of an old friend in the form of a Brahman is very significant. And as Paramatma feature, Krishna is the old friend of everyone. According to Vedic injunction, Krishna is sitting with the living entity side by side. According to the Shruti mantra, Dva Suparna Sayuja Sakhaya, the Lord is sitting within the heart of every living entity as Suhrit, the best friend. The Lord is always eager to have the living entity come home back to Godhead. Sitting with the living entity as witness, the Lord gives him all chances to enjoy himself materially. But whenever there is an opportunity, the Lord gives him good counsel and advises the living entity to abandon everything, trying to become happy through material adjustment He advises the living entity to abandon trying to become happy through material adjustment, and instead turn his face toward the Supreme Personality of Godhead and surrender unto Him. Okay. When one becomes serious to follow the mission of the spiritual master, his resolution is tantamount to seeing the Supreme Personality of Godhead. As explained before, this means meeting the Supreme Personality of Godhead in the instruction of the spiritual master. Okay. This is technically called Vani Seva. Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur states in his Bhagavad Gita commentary on the verse Vyavasayatmika Buddhir Ekehe Kurunandana, Bhagavad Gita 241, that one should serve the words of the spiritual master. The disciple must stick to whatever the spiritual master orders. Simply by following on that line, one sees the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The Supreme Personality of Godhead, Paramatma, appeared before the queen as a Brahman. But why didn't he appear in his original form as Sri Krishna? Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur remarks that unless one is very highly elevated and loving the Supreme Personality of Godhead, one cannot see him as he is. Nonetheless, if one sticks to the principles enunciated by the spiritual master, somehow or other he is in association with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Since the Lord is in the heart, he can advise a sincere disciple from within. This is also confirmed in Bhagavad Gita 10.10. Tesham satata yuktanam bhajatam pritipurvakam tadami buddhiyogam tam yena mam upayanti te. To those who are constantly devoted and worship me with love, I give the understanding by which they can come to me. In conclusion, if a disciple is very serious to execute the mission of the spiritual master, he immediately associates with the Supreme Personality of Godhead by Vani or Vapu. This is the only secret by his words or by being in his physical proximity. This is the only secret of success in seeing the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Instead of being eager to see the Lord in some bush in Vrindavan, while at the same time engaging in sense gratification, if one instead sticks to the principle of following the words of the spiritual master, he will see the Supreme Lord without difficulty. Srila Bilva Mangal Thakur has therefore said, Bhaktis tvayi stiratara bhagavan yadi syad, taivena na palati devya kishora murti, mukti swayam mukulitanjali sevate sman, dharmartha kamagataya samaya pratiksha. If I am engaged in devotional service unto you, my dear Lord, then very easily can I perceive your presence everywhere. And as far as liberation is concerned, I think that liberation stands at my door with folded hands, waiting to serve me. And all material conveniences of dharma, artha, and kama, religiosity, economic development, and sense gratification, stand with her. That's from Krishna Karnamita 107. If one is very highly advanced in devotional service, he will have no difficulty in seeing the Supreme Personality of Godhead. If one engages in the service of the spiritual master, He not only sees the Supreme Personality of Godhead, but attains liberation. As far as material conveniences are concerned, they automatically come, just as the maidservants of a queen follow the queen wherever she goes. Liberation is no problem for the pure devotee, and all material conveniences are simply awaiting him at all stages of life. Brahmana uvacha katam kasyasi ko vayam shayano yasya shochasi janasi kim sakayang mang yenagre vichachartaha. The Brahman inquired as follows: Who are you? Whose wife or daughter are you? Who is the man lying here? It appears you are lamenting for this dead body. Don't you recognize me? I am your eternal friend. You may remember that many times in the past you have consulted me. Purport. When a person's relatives dies, renunciation is automatically visible. Consultation with the Supersoul seated within everyone's heart is possible only when one is completely free from the contamination of material attachment. One who is sincere and pure gets an opportunity to consult the Supreme Personality of Godhead and His Paramatma feature sitting within everyone's heart. The Paramatma is always the Chaita Guru, the spiritual master within, and he comes before one externally as the instructor and initiator spiritual master. So within, he's the Chaita Guru, and externally, he's the Diksha and Shiksha Guru. The Lord can reside within the heart, and he can also come out before a person and give him instructions. Thus, the spiritual master is not different from the Supersoul sitting within the heart. An uncontaminated soul, or living entity, can get a chance to meet the Paramatma face to face, just as one gets a chance to consult with the Paramatma within his heart. Just as one gets a chance to consult with the Paramatma within his heart, one also gets a chance to see him actually situated before him. Then one can take instruction from the Supersoul directly. This is the duty of the pure devotee, to see the bona fide spiritual master and consult with the Supersoul within the heart. When the Brahman asked the woman who the man lying on the floor was, she answered that he was her spiritual master, and that she was perplexed about what to do in his absence. At such a time, the Supersoul immediately appears, provided the devotee is purified in heart by following the directions of the spiritual master. A sincere devotee who follows the instructions of a spiritual master certainly gets direct instructions from his heart. He gets instructions from his heart from the Supersoul. Thus, a sincere devotee is always helped directly or indirectly by the spiritual master and the Supersoul. This is confirmed in Chaitanya Charitamrita, Guru Krishna Prasade Pai Bhakti Lata Bij. If the devotee serves his spiritual master sincerely, Krishna automatically becomes pleased. Yasya prasadar bhagavat prasado. By satisfying the spiritual master, one automatically satisfies Krishna. Thus the devotee becomes enriched by both the spiritual master and Krishna. The Supersoul is eternally the friend of the living entity and always remains with him. The Supersoul has always been ready to help the living entity, even before the creation of this material world. It is therefore stated here, Yenagre vichacharta. The word agre means before the creation. Thus the Supersoul has been accompanying the living entity since before the creation. Apismarasi chatmanam avijñāta sakam sakhe hitvamam padaman vichan bhoma bhoga rato gata. The Brahman continued, My dear friend, even though you cannot immediately recognize me, can't you remember that in the past you had a very intimate friend? Unfortunately, you gave up my company and accepted a position as enjoyer of this material world. Purport. As stated in Bhagavad Gita 7.27, Ichadvesha samutena dvandamohena bharata sarvabhutani sammoham sargayanti parantapa. O scion of Bharata, Arjuna, O conqueror of the foe, all living entities are born into delusion, overcome by the dualities of desire and hate. This is an explanation of how the living entity falls down into this material world. In the spiritual world, there is no duality, nor is there hate. The Supreme Personality of Godhead expands himself into many. In order to enjoy bliss and more, the Supreme Lord expands himself in different categories. As mentioned in the Varaha Purana, he expands himself in Vishnu Tattva, the Samsa expansion, and in his marginal potency, the Vibhinaksha Tattva, are the living entity. Okay, yes. These expanded living entities are innumerable, just as the minute molecules of sunshine are innumerable expansions of the sun. The Vibhinaksha expansions, the marginal potencies of the Lord, are the living entities. Vibhinaksha means Vibhina means separated, and Angsha means parts. So they're the separated parts of the Lord. They're separate from the Lord, they're not. But the Swangsha, like the different incarnations and stuff, that Swa means his own, and Angsha means parts. So his own parts and his separated parts. When the living entities desire to enjoy themselves, they develop a consciousness of duality and come to hate the service of the Lord. They come to hate the service of the Lord. In this way, the living entities fall into the material world. In the Prema Vivarta, it is said, Krishna Bahir Mukha Hoya Bhogavancha Kore Nikatasta Māyā Tare Japatiya Dhare. The natural position of the living entity is to serve the Lord in a transcendental loving attitude. When the living entity wants to become Krishna himself or imitate Krishna, he falls down into the material world. Since Krishna is the Supreme Father, his affection for the living entity is eternal. When the living entity falls down into the material world, the Supreme Lord, through his Svangsa expansion, Paramatma, keeps company with the living entity. In this way, the living entity may someday return home back to Godhead. By misusing his independence, the living entity falls from the service of the Lord and takes a position in this material world as an enjoyer. That is to say, the living entity takes his position within a material body. Wanting to take a very exalted position, the living entity instead becomes entangled in a repetition of birth and death. He selects his position as a human being, a demigod, a cat, a dog, a tree, etc. In this way, the living entity selects a body out of the 8,400,000 forms and tries to satisfy himself by a variety of material enjoyment. The Supersoul, however, does not like him to do this. Consequently, the Supersoul instructs him to surrender unto the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The Lord then takes charge of the living entity. But unless the living entity is uncontaminated by material desires, he cannot surrender to the Supreme Lord. In Bhagavad Gita 5.29, the Lord says, Bhoktaram yagatapasam sarvaloka maheshwaram suhridam sarvabhutanam gyatva mam shantamrichati. The sages, knowing me as the ultimate purpose of all sacrifices and austerities, the Supreme Lord of all planets and demigods, and the benefactor and well-wisher of all living entities, attain peace from the pangs of material miseries. The Supreme Lord is the supreme friend of everyone. However, no one can take advantage of the Supreme Friend's instructions while making his own plans to become happy and entangling himself in the modes of material nature. When there is creation, the living entities take on different forms according to past desires. This means that all the species or forms of life are simultaneously created. Darwin's theory stating that no human being existed from the beginning, but that humans evolved after many, many years, is simply a nonsensical theory. From Vedic literature, we find that the first creature within the universe is Lord Brahma. Being the most intelligent personality, Lord Brahma could take charge of creating all the variety found within this material world. Hangsavaham chatvam charya sakayo manasayano abhutam antaravoka sahasra parivatsaram. My dear gentle friend, both you and I are exactly like two swans. We live together in the same heart, which is just like the Manasa lake. Although we have been living together for many thousands of years, we are still very far away from our original home. Purport. The original home of the living entity and the Supreme Personality of Godhead is the spiritual world. In the spiritual world, both the Lord and the living entities live together very peacefully. Since the living entity remains engaged in the service of the Lord, they both share a blissful life in the spiritual world. However, when the living entity wants to enjoy himself, he falls down into the material world. Even while he is in that position, the Lord remains with him as the Supersoul, his intimate friend. Because of his forgetfulness, the living entity does not know that the Supreme Lord is accompanying him as a Supersoul. In this way, the living entity remains conditioned in each and every millennium. Although the Lord follows him as a friend, the living entity, because of forgetful material existence, does not recognize him. Satang vihaya mam bando gata gramya matir mahim vicharan padamadrakshi kayachin nirmitam striya. My dear friend, you are now my very same friend. Since you left me, you have become more and more materialistic, and not seeing me, you have been traveling in different forms throughout this material world, which was created by some woman. Purport. When a living entity falls down, he goes into the material world, which was created by the external energy of the Lord. This external energy is described herein as some woman, or prakriti. This material world is composed of material elements, ingredients supplied by the Mahatattva, the total material energy. The material world created by this external energy becomes the so-called home of the conditioned soul. Within this material world, the conditioned soul accepts different apartments, or different bodily forms, and then travels about. Sometimes he travels in the higher planetary systems, and sometimes in the lower planetary systems. Sometimes he travels in higher species of life, and sometimes in lower species. He has been wandering within this material universe since time immemorial, as explained by Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Pramanda Brahmita Kona Bhagavana Jeev, Guru Krishna Prasade Pai Bhakti Lata Beach. Chaitanya Charitamrita Madhya Lila 19:151. The living entity wanders into many species of life, but he is fortunate when he once again meets his friend, either in person or through his representative. Actually, it is Krishna who personally advises all living entities to return home back to Godhead. Sometimes Krishna sends his representative, who, delivering Krishna's very message, canvasses all living entities to return home back to Godhead. Unfortunately, the living entity is so greatly attached to material enjoyment that he does not take the instructions of Krishna or his representative very seriously. This material tendency is mentioned in this verse as gramya mati, sense gratification. The word mahim means within this material world. All living entities within this material world are sensually inclined. Consequently, they become entangled in different types of bodies and suffer the pangs of material existence. Pancharamam navadvaram ekapalam trikoshtakam shatkulam panchavipanam panchaprakriti-stridvanam nadavam. In that city, the material body, there are 5 gardens, 9 gates, 1 protector, 3 apartments, 6 families, 5 stores, 5 material elements, and 1 woman who is lord of the house. Panchendriyartarama dvara prananava prabho tejo pannani koshtani kulam indriya sangraha. Is that a mistake? Oh, I guess not. I've never seen anything like that before. My dear friends, the 5 gardens are the 5 objects of sense enjoyment, and the protector is the life air, which passes through the 9 gates. The 3 apartments are the chief ingredients, fire, water, and earth. The 6 families are the aggregate total of the mind and 5 senses. Purport. The 5 senses that acquire knowledge are sight, taste, smell, sound, and touch, and these act through the 9 gates, the 2 eyes, 2 ears, 1 mouth, 2 nostrils, 1 genital, and 1 rectum. These holes are compared to gates in the walls of the city. The principal ingredients are earth, water, and fire, and the principal actor is the mind, which is controlled by the intelligence, buddhi. Vipamanastu kriya shaktir bhuta prakritiravya shaktadisha pumangstatra pravishto navabuddhate. The 5 stores are the 5 working sensory organs. They transact their business through the combined forces of the 5 elements, which are eternal. Behind all this activity is the soul. The soul is a person and an enjoyer in reality. However, because he is now hidden within the city of the body, he is devoid of knowledge. Purport. The living entity enters the material creation with the aid of the 5 elements, earth, water, fire, air, and ether, and thus his body is formed. Although the living entity is working from within, he is nonetheless unknown. The living entity enters the material creation, but because he is bewildered by the material energy, he appears to be hidden. The bodily conception of life is prominent because of ignorance, navabuddhate. Ignorance is described in the feminine gender, but owing to her prominence in all activities, she is described in this verse as adisha, the controller. The living entity lives by means of fire, water, and food grains. It is through the combination of these 3 that the body is attained. Consequently, the body is called prakriti, material creation. All the elements gradually combine to form flesh, bone, blood, and so on. All these appear as various apartments. It is said in the Vedas that the digested foods are ultimately divided into 3. The solid portion becomes stool, and the semi-liquid portion turns into flesh. The liquid portion turns yellow and is again divided into 3. One of these liquid portions is called urine. Similarly, the fiery portion is divided into 3, and one is called bone. Out of the 5 elements, fire, water, and food grains are very important. These 3 are mentioned in the previous verse, whereas sky, ether, and air are not mentioned. This is all explained in Bhagavad Gita 13:20. Prakritim purusham chaiva vidyanadi ubhavapi vikaramscha gunangschaiva vidhi prakriti sambhava. Material nature in the living entity should be understood to be beginningless. The transformations and the modes of matter are products of material nature. I'm just seeing everything is there. Yes. Okay, sorry. Prakriti, material nature, and Purusha, the living entity, are eternal. When they both come in contact, there are different reactions and manifestations. All of them should be considered the results of the interaction of the 3 modes of material nature. Tasming stvam ramaya sprishto ramamano shuta smriti tatsangad idrishim prapto dasham papi yasim prabhu. My dear friend, when you enter such a body along with a woman of material desires, you become overly absorbed in sense enjoyment. Because of this, you have forgotten your spiritual life. Due to your material conceptions, you are placed in various miserable conditions. Purport. When a person becomes materially engrossed, he has no capacity to hear about spiritual existence. Forgetfulness of spiritual existence entangles a man more and more in material existence. Such is the result of sinful life. Various bodies are developed with the material ingredients because of different types of sinful activities. King Puranjan assumed the body of a woman, Vaidarbhī, as a result of his sinful activities. Bhagavad Gita clearly says, Striyo Vaishyas Tata Shudra, that such a body is low-born. If one takes shelter of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, however, he can be elevated to the highest perfection, even though he be low-born. If one acquires lower births when one's spiritual intelligence is reduced. Na tvam Vaidarbhā duhita nayam vira suritava na patistvam puranjanya ruddho nava mukheyaya. Actually, you are not the daughter of Vaidarbhā, nor is this man, Malayadvaja, your well-wishing husband, nor were you the actual husband of Puranjani. You are simply captivated in this body of 9 gates. Purport. In the material world, many living entities come into contact with one another and, increasing their attachment to a particular type of body, become related as father, husband, mother, wife, etc. Actually, every living entity is a separate individual being, and it is because of his contact with matter that he comes together with other bodies and becomes falsely related. False bodies create various associations in the name of family, community, society, and nationality. Actually, every living entity is part and parcel of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. But the living entities are overly engrossed in the material body. The Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna, appears and gives instructions in the form of Bhagavad Gita and Vedic literatures. The Supreme Lord gives these instructions because he is the eternal friend of the living entities. His instructions are important because by them the living entity can obtain liberation from bodily engagement. As water passes down a river, many straws and grasses are carried from the shore. These straws and grasses come together in the river's current, but when the waves toss this way and that, they are separated and carried somewhere else. Similarly, the innumerable living entities within the material world are being carried by the waves of material nature. Sometimes the waves bring them together and they form friendships and relate to one another on a bodily basis of family, community, or nationality. Eventually, they are thrown out of association by the waves of material nature. This process has been going on since the creation of material nature. In this regard, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur sings, Miche māyā vashe Jacho veshe kacho habudu bhuvai Jiva Krishna das e vishwas korleto artu kanai Radha Krishna bobo bolore sabai. My dear living entities, you are being carried away by the waves of material nature. Sometimes you are on the surface, sometimes you are being drowned. In this way, your eternal life is being spoiled. If you simply catch hold of Krishna and take shelter of his lotus feet, you will once again get free from all miserable material conditions. In this verse, the words Suhrit, well-wisher, and Tava, your, are very significant. One's so-called husband, relative, son, father, or whatever cannot actually be, they cannot actually be a well-wisher. The only actual well-wisher is Krishna himself, as Krishna confirms in Bhagavad Gita 5.29. Suhridam sarvabhutanam. Society, friendship, love, and well-wishers are all simply results of being packed in different bodies. One should know this well, and try to get out of this bodily engagement into which one is thrown birth after birth. One should take shelter of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna, and return home back to Godhead. Māyā yesha maya srishta yat pumangsam striyam satim manyase no bhayam yadvai hangso pasya vayorgatim. Sometimes you think yourself a man, sometimes a chaste woman, and sometimes a neutral eunuch. This is all because of the body, which is created by the illusory energy. This illusory energy is my potency, and actually both of us, you and I, are pure spiritual entities. Now just try to understand this. I am trying to explain our factual position. Purport. The factual position of both the Supreme Lord, Personality of Godhead and the living entity is qualitatively one. The Supreme Lord is the Supreme Spirit, the Supersoul, and the living entity is the individual spiritual soul. Even though both of them are original spiritual entities, the living entity forgets his identity when he comes into contact with material nature and becomes conditioned. At such a time, he identifies himself as a product of the material nature. Because of the material body, he forgets that he is the eternal, Sanatan, part and parcel of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. This is confirmed in this way. Māyā jiva loke jiva bhuta sanatana. The word sanatana is found in several places in Bhagavad Gita. Both the Lord and the living entity are sanatan, eternal, and there is also a place known as sanatan, beyond this material nature. The real residence of both the living entity and God is the domain of Sanatan, not this material world. The material world is the temporary external energy of the Lord, and the living entity is placed in this material world because he wanted to imitate the position of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. In this material world, he tries to enjoy his senses to his best capacity. All the activities of the conditioned soul within this material world are perpetually taking place in different types of bodies. But when the living entity acquires developed consciousness, he should try to rectify his situation and again become a member of the spiritual world. The process by which one can return home, back to Godhead, is Bhakti Yoga, sometimes called Sanatan Dharma. Instead of accepting a temporary occupational duty based on the material body, one should take to the process of Sanatan Dharma, or Bhakti Yoga, so that he can put an end to this perpetual bondage in material bodies and return home back to Godhead. As long as human society works on the basis of false material identification, all the so-called advancements of science and philosophy are simply useless. They only serve to mislead human society. Anda yatandar upaniyamanad. In the material world, the blind simply lead the blind. Aham bhavan nachanyastvam tvam evaham vichakshvabo no pashyanti kavayash chidram jatu managapi. My dear friend, I, the Supersoul, and you, the individual soul, are not different in quality, for we are both spiritual. In fact, my dear friend, you are qualitatively not different from me in your constitutional position. Just try to consider this subject. Those who are actually advanced scholars, who are in knowledge, do not find any qualitative difference between you and me. Purport. Both the Supreme Personality of Godhead and the living entity are qualitatively one. There is no factual difference between the two. The Mayavadi philosophers are again and again defeated by the illusory energy because they think that there is no separation between the Supersoul and the individual soul, or that there is no Supersoul. They are also misled into thinking that everything is a Supersoul. However, those who are Kavaya, learned scholars, actually know the facts. They do not commit such mistakes. They know that God and the individual soul are one in quality, but the individual soul falls under the clutches of Maya, whereas the Supersoul, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, is the controller of Maya. Maya is the creation of the Supreme Lord, the Maya Shrishta. Therefore, the Supreme Lord is the controller of Maya. Although one in quality with the Supreme Lord, the individual soul is under the control of Maya. Mayavadi philosophers cannot distinguish between the controller and the controlled. Yatta purusham atmanam ekam adarsha chakshusho vidabhutam aveksheta tattaivantaramavyaya. Wow, this is a long purport. Okay. We might end after this purport because it's very long. As a person sees the reflection of his body in a mirror to be one with himself and not different, whereas others actually see two bodies, so in our material condition, in which the living being is affected and yet not affected, there is a difference between God and the living entity. I didn't catch that. Wait one second. When a person sees a reflection of his body in a mirror, others actually see two bodies. So in our material condition, in which the living entity is affected and yet not affected, there's a difference between God and the... Okay. Purport. Being affected by the conditioning of matter, Mayavadi philosophers cannot see the difference between the Supreme Lord and the living entity. When the sun is reflected in a pot of water, the sun knows that there is no difference between himself and the reflected sun in the water. Those in ignorance, however, perceive that there are many small suns reflected in each and every pot. As far as the brilliance is concerned, there is brilliance both in the original sun and in the reflections, but the reflections are small, whereas the original sun is very large. Vaishnava philosophers conclude that the living entity is simply a small sample of the original Supreme Personality of Godhead. Qualitatively, God and the living entities are one, but quantitatively, the living entities are small fragments of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The Supreme Lord is full, powerful, and opulent. In the previous verse, the Lord says, "My dear friends, you and I are not different." This non-difference refers to qualitative oneness, for it was not necessary for the Paramatma, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, to remind the conditioned soul that he is not one in quantity. The self-realized soul never thinks that he and the Supreme Personality of Godhead are one in every respect. Although he and the Supreme Personality of Godhead are one in quality, the living entity is prone to forget his spiritual identity, whereas the Supreme Personality never forgets. This is the difference between lipta and alipta. The Supreme Personality of Godhead is eternally alipta, uncontaminated by the material energy. The conditioned soul, however, being in contact with material nature, forgets his real identity. Therefore, when he sees himself in the conditioned state, he identifies himself with the body. For the Supreme Personality of Godhead, however, there is no difference between the body and the soul. He is completely soul. He has no material body. Although the Supersoul, Paramatma, and the individual soul are both within the body, the Supersoul is devoid of designation, whereas the conditioned soul is designated by his particular type of body. The Supersoul is called Antaryami, and he is extensive. This is confirmed in Bhagavad Gita 13.3. Kshetragyam chapimam vedi sarva kshetreshu bharata. O scion of Bharata, you should understand that I am also the knower in all bodies. The Supersoul is present in everyone's body, whereas the individual soul is conditioned into one particular type of body. The individual soul cannot understand that what is taking place in another's body. But the Supersoul knows very well what is happening in all bodies. In other words, the Supersoul is always present in his full spiritual position, whereas the individual soul is prone to forget himself. Nor is the individual soul present everywhere. Generally, in his conditioned states, the individual soul cannot understand his relationship with the Supersoul. But sometimes, when he is freed from all conditional existence, so sometimes when the living entity, when the soul is free from all conditional existence, he can see the real difference between the Supersoul and himself. When the Supersoul tells the conditioned soul, "You and I are one and the same," it is to remind the conditioned soul of his spiritual identity as being qualitatively one. In the third canto of Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam 3:28-40, it is said, Yatol mukar vispulingar dumarvapi swasambhavat apyatmatvena bhimatar yatagni pritagul mukat. Fire has different features. There is flame, the sparks, and the smoke. Although these are one in quality, there is still a difference between the fire, the flame, the spark, and the smoke. The living entity becomes conditioned, but the Supreme Personality of Godhead is different because he does not become conditioned at any point. In the Vedas it is stated, Atma Tata Pritag Drashta Bhagavan Brahma Samgita. Atma is the individual soul, as well as the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who is the seer of everything. Although both are spirit, there is always a difference. In the Smriti it is also said, Tagne Kshudra Vishpulinga Vyucharanti. Just as sparks manifest in a large fire, similarly, the small individual souls are present in a big spiritual flame. In Bhagavad Gita 9:4, Lord Krishna says, Matstani sarvabhutani na chaham te shavastita. All beings are in me, but I am not in them. Although all living beings are resting in him, as small fiery sparks rest on a large flame, both are differently situated. Similarly, in the Vishnu Puran it is stated, Ekadesha stita sagner dotsna vistarini yata parasya brahmana shaktis tatedam akilam jagat. Fire is situated in one place, but it distributes heat and light. Similarly, the Supreme Personality of Godhead is distributing his energies in different ways. The living entity is but one of the three energies. He's the marginal energy. The energy and the energetic are one in one sense, but they are differently situated as energy and the energetic. Similarly, the Satchidananda form confirmed in Brahma Samhita, Ishvara Paramakrishna Satchidananda Vigraha, is different from that of the living entity in both his conditioned and liberated states. Only atheists consider the living entity and the personality of Godhead equal in all aspects. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu therefore says, Mayavadi bhashya shunile hoy sarvanash. If one follows the instructions of Mayavadi philosophers and believes that the Supreme Personality of Godhead and the individual soul are one, his understanding of real philosophy is forever doomed. Alright, so we will continue tomorrow, because now it is 8 o'clock. Tomorrow we will read, and this way one swan, after being instructed by the other, regained his original Krishna consciousness, which was lost because of his aversion to the Lord. Thus I have given spiritual instructions indirectly through an allegory. Since the Lord can be known indirectly, or he is fond of indirect expression. Okay, there's two meanings of that word. Paroksha priyo. Alright, so 2 more verses left, but I don't want to go too far over time. So, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Nitai Gaur Hari Bol, Hari Bol, Hari Bol. Nitai Gaur Hari Bol, Nitai Gaur Hari Bol, Hari Bol, Hari Bol, Nitai Gaur Hari Bol. Jai Shishi Guru Gauranga Gandharvika Giridhari Shri Shri Radha Vinod Bihari Ju Ki Jai. Shri Govinda Gopinath Maran Mohan Ju Ki Jai. Nitil Pravishto Vishnupad Ashtara Shatashmad Srila Bhakti Vedanta Narayan Gosai Maharaj Srila Guru Devi Ki Jai. Nitil Pravishto Vishnupad Ashtara Shatashmad Srila Bhakti Vedanta Vaman Gosai Maharaj Ki Jai. Nitil Pravishto Vishnupad Ashtara Shatashmad Srila Bhakti Vedanta Vaman Gosai Maharaj Ki Jai. Nitil Pravishto Vishnupad Ashtara Shatashmad Srila Bhakti Vedanta Swami Maharaj Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Nitil Pravishto Vishnupad Ashtara Shatashmad Srila Bhakti Pragyan Keshav Goswami Maharaj Ki Jai. Nitil Pravishto Vishnupad Ashtara Shatashmad Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Goswami Prabhupada Ki Jai. Nitil Pravishto Maha-Bhagavat Srila Gorksharas Babaji Maharaj Ki Jai. Nitil Pravishto Srila Satchidananda Bhakti Vinod Thakur Ki Jai. Nitil Pravishta Vaishnav Sarvabhauma Srila Jagannath Das Babaji Maharaj Ki Jai. Shri Rupanu Gauriya Guru Varga Ki Jai. Shri Rup Sanatan Bhatta Raghunath Shri Jeev Gopal Pata Dashagunath Shara Gosai Prabhu Ki Jai. Shri Sarup Damodar Rai Ramanandari Shri Gaur Parshad Vrinda Ki Jai. Namachay Shri Haridas Thakur Ki Jai. Prem Se Kaho Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shri Vasari Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Ki Jai. Shri Kshetra Mandal Gaura Mandal Vrajamandal Mathura Vrindavan Dham Ki Jai. Sarva Avishta Pradata Giriraj Maharaj Ki Jai. Shri Radhakun Shamakun Yamuna Ganga Tulsi Bhakti Devi Ki Jai. Shri Harinam Sankirtan Ki Jai. Ananta Koti Vaishnav Vrinda Ki Jai. Samagata Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Ki Jai. Shri Nitai Gaur Premanande Hari Hari Bo. Om Vrindai Tulsi Devai Priyai Keshavashacha Krishna Bhakti Patadevi Satyavatai Namo Namaha. Vancha Kalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Dandavat Pranams. Oh, and Rup Manjari is saying, so confusing since it was as Vaidarbhī this Atma got success. This purport 60 is also difficult for me to understand. What about our Vaishnava family and friends? It seems she got so much benefit from acting as Malaya Dvaja's devoted wife. Yeah, but I think I have to read the purport again because I'm a little bit spaced out. But there's a difference, like with the way that we relate with each other. There's a way where we're trying to. I have to read the purport though because I forgot actually what was said there. Okay. But there's a difference between material attachment and, becoming connected on a material level and becoming connected in a spiritual way. Just like you can have friendships and connect in service together and in an uplifting spiritual way. But if you become attached for your, wanting something. So in service and in glorifying the Lord and becoming attached in that way, that's a different case. But if we're becoming attached to each other in a mundane way, because you please me, because, we like the same kind of things, we like, in that way, then that's, I think, what was being described. But I can't actually really remember what was spoken in purport 60, so I don't know if that is even a relevant answer. Okay, Haribol. Okay. Yeah, okay. I'll check it out again though. Haribol. Dandavat Pranams.